Hey, I'm Emma, and I'm here to tell you a story that will absolutely shatter your understanding of what it means to love someone completely. This story is about a woman named Britney, 26 years old, independent, fiercely proud of her equality in relationships, and she made a choice that cost her everything. Britney believed she had relationships figured out. She thought she understood love, partnership, and what it meant to build a life with someone. But then she met Rowan, and everything she thought she knew was about to be tested in the most devastating way possible. This is the story of how two people who seemed absolutely perfect for each other became completely incompatible over a single conversation. A conversation that happened on an ordinary Tuesday night. A conversation about a prenuptial agreement. A conversation that would end their relationship forever. And here's the thing that makes this story so important. Britney wasn't wrong about what she believed, but she also wasn't right. And that's exactly what makes this so heartbreaking. 2 years before everything fell apart, Britney was just going through her morning routine. Coffee before work, same order, same coffee shop downtown in Denver. She wasn't looking for anything special that day. She wasn't manifesting love or putting energy into the universe. She was just existing. That's when she saw him. Rowan was sitting at a corner table, laptop open, focused, serious. There was something about him that immediately caught her attention. Not in that flashy, obviously attractive way. It was different. He had this quiet confidence, this sense of responsibility and stability that seemed so rare in her dating history. The guys she usually dated were still living like college students, even though they were nearly 30. They wanted to play games, act immature, make everything complicated. But Rowan felt different from the very first moment. The best part? They connected over the most mundane thing ever. Britney accidentally grabbed his coffee order. She reached for what she thought was hers on the counter, and it was his exact same drink. When she realized her mistake, instead of being awkward about it, Rowan made a joke. Something about great minds thinking alike. And just like that, they started talking. Not for 5 minutes. Not for 10 minutes. They talked for 20 minutes about everything and nothing. Random stories. Observations about life. The kind of effortless conversation that doesn't feel forced or performative. And Britney could immediately tell this man wasn't trying to impress her. He wasn't talking about how much money he made or what he owned. He wasn't putting on some fake persona to seem cool or successful. He was just real. And real was exactly what Britney had been searching for her entire life. What made this moment even more perfect was that they were equals. Britney had worked hard to build her own career. She was making decent money, nothing extravagant, just enough to live comfortably in an expensive city. And Rowan was in a very similar position. They were both regular people, both working, both grinding it out in the kind of place where your paycheck barely keeps up with the cost of living. For Britney, this was everything. She had always believed in splitting things equally in relationships. She couldn't stand the idea of being dependent on someone else. She'd watched too many women, and honestly, she'd judged too many women who'd expect men to pay for everything. Women who'd conveniently forget their wallets when the dinner bill came. Women who seemed to think that being a girlfriend meant never contributing financially. Britney had promised herself she would never be that woman. When she and Rowan started dating officially, she made something very clear. She wasn't looking for a sugar daddy. She paid for her own drinks. She insisted on splitting dinner bills. Sometimes she'd even get separate Uber rides just to prove to herself, and to him, that she wasn't trying to use him. She thought she was being the perfect girlfriend. Independent, fair, modern, not clingy, not needy. Not like all those other women she knew, who always seemed to want something from the men they dated. And Rowan seemed to absolutely love this about her. He'd tell his friends how different Britney was, how she wasn't like his ex-girlfriend, who apparently had expected him to fund her entire lifestyle. Those words meant everything to Britney. They made her feel special. Like she was doing relationships the right way while everyone else was out there making mistakes. Those first few months were honestly perfect. They had this natural rhythm together, taking turns planning dates, splitting grocery bills when they cooked together at his apartment, never fighting about money, never creating weird power dynamics. They were just two people building something authentic. No games, no manipulation, just real connection and genuine partnership. And then Rowan went through something that would change everything about how Britney saw herself in this relationship. He lost his job. 3 months. 3 long months of unemployment. Every single day he was sending out resumes, going to interviews, getting rejection after rejection. It was brutal. It was demoralizing. And he was struggling in ways that Britney could see wearing on him emotionally. But here's the thing. Britney was there for him. She started buying groceries for both of them. She suggested free activities like hiking or watching outdoor movies. She was constantly telling him that something better was coming, that this was temporary, that his potential was real, and that he was going to land something amazing. And honestly, there was something about being needed that made Britney feel incredibly important in that moment. She wasn't like her friends, who'd constantly complain about their boyfriends being lazy or unmotivated. She had someone with real potential, someone who just needed support and encouragement to get back on his feet. She felt validated by being that person for him, like she was proving what kind of partner she could be when things got difficult. When Rowan finally landed his new position, it felt like a victory for both of them. He was grateful, deeply grateful. He kept telling her how much her support had meant to him, how he never could have gotten through those 3 months without her belief in him. And Britney felt so validated. Like her faith in him had been absolutely right. They celebrated with a nice dinner, his treat since he'd just gotten his first paycheck. Everything felt like it was finally falling into place. Everything felt solid and promising, and like their relationship was about to enter this new, better chapter. For several months after that, their relationship felt genuinely solid and comfortable. They started talking seriously about moving in together, getting a place with better amenities now that they both had stable income again. Britney found herself browsing apartment listings late at night, imagining how they'd decorate the space together. Maybe they'd get a cat. Really build a life as a team, the kind of life that felt real and permanent. She even started thinking about engagement timelines. Britney won't admit it to just anyone, but when her friends would joke about her being next to get married, she'd laugh it off on the surface. But deep down, she was secretly hoping they were right. She'd pay close attention to how Rowan reacted when couples around them got engaged. She was trying to gauge where his head was at regarding their future. She was imagining their wedding. Something simple and meaningful. Just close friends and family. Writing their own vows. Promising to support each other through everything. Everything felt natural. Everything felt right. They never fought about money. Everything was split fairly when Rowan stayed at her place. They seemed to want the exact same things. A stable, loving partnership built on trust and mutual respect. Britney felt like they were different from all those messy, dramatic couples she'd see everywhere. The ones constantly fighting about stupid stuff. The ones with communication problems and fundamental incompatibilities. She and Rowan, they were solid. They had something real and lasting. They'd talk about their future plans with absolute certainty. Vacations they wanted to take together. How many children they might want someday. Retirement dreams they could build together. It all felt so secure and inevitable. Britney was already mentally planning their wedding in her mind. And then everything changed. Rowan got a massive promotion at work. We're talking about serious money. More than double what he'd been making before. Suddenly, he had wealth that he'd never had before. Financial security that changed his entire perspective on life. At first, Britney was thrilled for him. For them. She thought this meant they could finally start making those bigger life goals a reality. A house. More elaborate vacations. The kind of things they'd only talked about in passing. But then something shifted in their dynamic. Rowan started suggesting restaurants that Britney knew would cost her an entire week's worth of groceries just for her portion of the meal. He wanted to upgrade their weekend plans to things that would seriously stretch her budget. And Britney found herself having to decline or suggest cheaper alternatives. She could see the frustration on his face when she'd have to say no. When she'd have to be realistic about what her salary could actually handle. And that's when the shame started. Britney began feeling like the broke girlfriend holding him back from enjoying his success. When they'd go out to eat, she'd spend the whole meal calculating in her head, how much is my half of this bill? Can I actually afford to do this? It was embarrassing. It was stressful. It completely ruined the experience of being present and enjoying the moment with the man she loved. So when Rowan started offering to pay for more things, Britney eventually stopped refusing. At first, there was guilt wrapped around it. She felt uncomfortable. But honestly, it was also a relief. She didn't have to constantly worry about whether she could afford to keep up with his new lifestyle. The anxiety disappeared, and Rowan seemed to genuinely enjoy being able to treat her. He'd get this proud look when he'd pick up the dinner tab, when he'd suggest a weekend trip without asking her to contribute. Britney convinced herself this was just natural. This was how relationships evolved when one person started making significantly more money. The person with more resources should contribute more. That made sense. That felt fair. That was just logical. Her friends seemed to agree with this logic too. When she'd mentioned feeling weird about Rowan paying for more, they'd roll their eyes and tell her to just enjoy it. That's what boyfriends are for, they'd say. Live a little. And part of Britney agreed with them. She'd grown up watching her mom struggle financially after Britney's dad left. There was something deeply comforting about being with someone who had the resources to handle things. Someone who could take care of expenses without it being a burden. It felt safe in a way that was almost primal. But then Rowan started talking about things that made Britney deeply uncomfortable. He'd bring up investment strategies, retirement planning, building wealth together. He'd talk about these things like they were already married, like they were a team making major financial decisions. Britney would nod along because she didn't want to seem unsupportive. But internally, she was uneasy. This felt premature. They weren't even engaged yet. Why were they talking about this like it was already decided? When he'd mentioned things like credit scores and debt-to-income ratios, Britney would try to change the subject. It felt too serious, too businesslike, too calculated for where they were in their relationship. She wanted romance. She wanted love and partnership. She didn't want to feel like she was in financial planning meetings. The dynamic started shifting in a way that felt really uncomfortable. It was less like they were building a life together, and more like Rowan was trying to manage her financial future. Like he was taking control of something that should have been her own responsibility. And that rubbed her the wrong way in ways she couldn't fully articulate. Between the two of them, Britney had never asked him to take care of her financially. She had her own job, her own goals, her own money. She didn't want him thinking she was with him just for his paycheck. But at the same time, she'd gotten used to the nicer dinners and the freedom of not having to calculate every expense down to the penny. It was confusing because she appreciated his generosity. But she also started to resent what felt like strings attached to it. He'd pay for dinner and then later make some comment about their money or their future. And Britney would think, wait, when did my money become our money just because you paid for Thai food? She started noticing that he'd bring up financial stuff at the weirdest times. They'd be having a perfectly normal conversation about something completely random, and somehow he'd steer it back to money management, investment opportunities, building wealth. It was like he'd become obsessed with wealth building now that he actually had wealth to build. And the worst part? He'd talk about it like they were a team making these decisions together. But he'd never actually ask her opinion about anything. He'd just assume she'd want to do whatever made the most financial sense. Like she didn't have her own thoughts about her future. Like she was just a piece of his financial puzzle. Britney started to feel like he saw her as some kind of financial project. Like he was trying to optimize their relationship for maximum wealth accumulation. And that was about the least romantic thing she could possibly imagine. She tried to tell herself he was just being practical, that financial security was important for couples, but something about the way he approached it felt wrong. It was too calculated, too focused on protecting and growing assets instead of just living their lives and enjoying what they already had. Britney missed the simplicity of when they'd made the same amount of money. Everything had been naturally equal, pure and uncomplicated. Now their relationship felt weighted down with unspoken expectations and assumptions about money that she'd never agreed to. And she started questioning whether they even wanted the same things anymore. Whether his priorities had shifted now that he had something to protect. And then came Tuesday night in March. They were sitting on his couch talking about officially moving in together, looking at apartments with better amenities now that his income had increased so dramatically. Britney was excited. She was imagining a pool, maybe in-unit laundry, finally living somewhere that felt grown-up and successful. But then the conversation took a turn. Rowan started talking about lease agreements and who would be responsible for what expenses. And then he went somewhere Britney never saw coming. He started talking about property ownership, asset protection, legal documents, and then he said the words that made her stomach absolutely drop. We should probably talk about a prenup for when we get married. Britney felt like she'd been physically slapped across the face. Here she was, imagining their future together, planning their shared life, and he was thinking about protecting himself from her. He was already planning for their marriage to potentially fail. He was building in legal escape hatches before they'd even walked down the aisle. She asked him why he would even bring this up, and Rowan started explaining. He talked about divorce statistics. He talked about his friends who'd gotten taken advantage of in their breakups. He kept saying it wasn't personal, that it was just smart financial planning. But how could it not be personal? He was literally planning for their relationship to fail before they were even engaged. Britney couldn't believe this was the same man who used to tell her how different she was from other women, how much he trusted her, how lucky he felt to have found someone genuine. Now he was treating her like every other potential gold digger who might try to steal his money. She told him that wasn't what marriage was supposed to be, not a business transaction that needed legal protection. She'd always believed that when you truly love someone, you trust them completely. You don't marry someone you think might screw you over financially. But Rowan kept talking about being in a vulnerable position. Now that he had money, he felt vulnerable. And Britney wanted to absolutely scream at him. Vulnerable to her? To the woman who'd supported him through 3 months of unemployment? The woman who'd never once made him feel bad about money? The woman who'd proven over and over again that she wasn't with him for financial reasons? The more he talked about statistics and protecting his assets, the more insulted Britney felt. She'd been there when he had nothing. She'd encouraged him, believed in him, never judged him for his situation. Now that the tables had turned and he was successful, he wanted legal protection from her. She explained that she'd never even thought about his money as something she was entitled to. She had her own career, her own goals. She wasn't looking for someone to take care of her. But apparently none of that mattered to him. Britney told him that if he wanted to protect his assets from her, then maybe they should forget about marriage entirely. Why complicate things with wedding vows if he needed a legal contract to feel safe combining his life with her? The argument became more heated because Rowan kept insisting it wasn't about trust. But Britney couldn't see it any other way. If you trust someone completely, you don't need a prenup. If you need a prenup, you don't trust them. It seemed that simple to her, that logical. He started bringing up examples of people they knew who'd gotten divorced, how messy it had been financially. But those weren't them. Those couples had obvious problems, communication issues, fundamental incompatibilities. We were different, Britney thought. We were solid. Or at least, she'd thought they were solid until he basically told her he wanted an escape hatch built into their marriage before it even started. The whole thing made Britney feel like she didn't know him anymore. This wasn't the man she'd fallen in love with, the one who talked about trust and partnership. This was someone who'd let money and fear transform him into a suspicious, calculating person she barely recognized. After that conversation, Britney couldn't let it go. Every single interaction with Rowan felt different, tainted, poisoned by what he'd said. When he'd pay for dinner, she'd wonder if he was calculating it as money he might need to protect from her later. When he'd talk about work or his success, she'd hear it as him bragging about assets she'd apparently never have access to. The whole foundation of their relationship felt like it had shifted. Britney kept bringing up the prenup thing, hoping he'd realize how hurtful and insulting his suggestion was. She thought he'd take it back. She thought he'd realize he was wrong. But instead of backing down, Rowan doubled down. He'd send her articles about financial planning for couples. He'd tell her stories from his co-workers about messy divorces. Like he was building some kind of case for why they needed legal protection from each other. Britney wanted to scream at him that she wasn't those other women. She'd already proven her character by standing by him through his worst times. She'd been there when he had nothing. How could he still see her as a potential threat? She made a decision. She decided to test him. Britney started making comments about how she couldn't marry someone who saw her as a potential financial threat. She'd bring up friends who'd gotten married without prenups, couples who trusted each other completely and weren't afraid to legally bind their lives together. She wanted him to realize that asking for a prenup was basically asking her to accept that he saw their marriage as likely to fail, that he was already planning his exit strategy. But he wouldn't budge. Every time she brought it up, he'd give her the same speech about being practical and responsible, about protecting what he'd worked hard to build, like she was some kind of threat to his financial security, instead of the woman who'd supported him when he had nothing. Britney started getting more direct about how his attitude was affecting her emotionally. She told him that his insistence on a prenup proved he didn't love her the way she loved him. If he really loved her, he'd want to share everything with her, build a life where they were true partners in every sense. She accused him of being influenced by toxic ideas about women and money, probably from his bitter divorced friends who'd poisoned his mind against marriage. She pointed out that she'd never once asked him for anything expensive, never made him feel like she was with him for his money. She'd proven over 2 years that she was different. The arguments became more frequent and intense. Britney found herself saying things specifically designed to hurt him, reminding him how she'd supported him during unemployment, how she'd been there taking care of him when he needed her most. Now that he was successful, he wanted to make sure she could never claim any benefit from the life they'd built together. She made ultimatums, telling him that if he couldn't trust her enough to marry her without a prenup, then maybe they weren't right for each other. Britney was hoping he'd realize what he was about to lose. She thought he'd choose their love over his financial paranoia. Instead, he started getting more distant. When she'd bring up the prenup issue, he'd shut down the conversation. He'd say they were going in circles and needed to agree to disagree. But how do you agree to disagree about something so fundamental to how you see marriage? Britney felt like he was being stubborn and selfish, prioritizing his money over their relationship. She started wondering if he'd only been with her in the beginning because she was low maintenance and didn't cost him much. Now that he had real money, maybe he was looking for ways to keep it all away from her. The more she thought about it, the more betrayed she felt. She'd invested 2 years in this relationship. She'd supported him through his worst times. She'd proven her loyalty and character over and over again. And his response was to ask her to sign a legal document limiting her rights in their future marriage. It felt like he was saying that despite everything they'd been through together, he still didn't really trust her. That deep down, he thought she might be the type of person who would try to take advantage of him financially. That hurt more than Britney could even explain. About 3 weeks later, Rowan came home and said he wanted to have what he called a calm, productive discussion. He'd been researching different types of prenup agreements. He wanted to present options that might make her more comfortable with the idea. And then he started explaining it like he was giving a business presentation. He talked about sunset clauses, partial asset protection, different legal structures and protections, and something inside Britney just completely snapped. She told him she couldn't believe he'd spent weeks figuring out more creative ways to protect himself from her, instead of reconsidering whether he should marry someone he felt he needed protection from in the first place. She asked him point blank, "Do you think I'm the type of person who would try to take advantage of you financially?" When Rowan hesitated before answering, Britney knew everything she needed to know. That pause told her everything. Deep down, he wasn't completely sure he could trust her, and that uncertainty was enough for him to want legal safeguards. His hesitation hurt worse than if he'd just said yes outright. Britney told him that his hesitation proved they shouldn't get married at all. If he had any doubts about her character or her motivations after 2 years together, then he wasn't ready for the kind of partnership she wanted. The fight escalated. He called her emotional instead of practical, and that word, emotional, absolutely set her off. Of course she was emotional. The person she loved was treating her like a potential con artist. Britney told him that if he wanted to be practical, then the most practical thing would be for them to break up since he clearly wasn't ready for real marriage. She gave him an ultimatum. No prenup or no wedding and no more relationship. She figured that would wake him up, make him realize what he was about to lose. She thought he'd choose her. She was wrong. 2 days later, Rowan asked her to meet him at that same coffee shop where they'd first met 2 years ago. Britney thought he was going to apologize. She thought he was going to tell her he'd realized love was more important than protecting his money. Instead, he told her he'd been thinking about everything she'd said, and he'd come to realize they wanted fundamentally different things from marriage. He said he couldn't marry someone who saw financial planning and asset protection as a betrayal of love, rather than a responsible part of building a life together. And then he ended it. "I'm Emma, and that's the story of Britney." That's a woman who believed so strongly in unconditional love and trust that she couldn't imagine a marriage without it. A woman who was willing to walk away from someone she loved rather than compromise on what she believed love should be. But here's the thing about Britney's story that I want you to really think about as you're listening. Britney wasn't wrong about her values. Trust in a relationship is important. Feeling valued and trusted by your partner is essential. But Britney also couldn't see that Rowan was trying to love her in a different way. He was trying to be responsible. He was trying to build something that could weather any storm. Sometimes in relationships, the person we think is betraying us is actually just scared. Scared of being hurt. Scared of losing what he'd worked so hard to build. Within a month, Rowan had taken a job in Chicago and moved away completely. Britney found out through mutual friends that he'd started dating someone new almost immediately. Someone who understood that a prenup wasn't about love. It was about being smart and practical. A year later, Britney saw on Facebook that Rowan had gotten engaged to this woman. There was a massive diamond ring, an expensive resort wedding planned. He looked happier than he'd ever looked with Britney. And Britney realized something that still haunts her to this day. Sometimes the person we believe is wrong is actually just different from us. And sometimes different is a deal breaker. If you've made it this far in the story, I hope you've learned something about relationships, about compromise, and about what it means to truly love someone. Because love isn't just about trust. Sometimes it's about understanding that the person you love might need things from you that feel foreign. Things that challenge your beliefs about what marriage should be. Thank you so much for listening to this story with me. If Britney's journey resonated with you, if you found yourself understanding her perspective or maybe even understanding Rowan's perspective, please hit that like button. Share this video with friends who need to hear this story. And most importantly, subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any of these deeply human stories that we tell here on Mrs. Emma. I'm Emma, your storyteller, and I'll see you in the next one.